I can moderate the question.
Please, that would be useful.
Councilor Flyman, go ahead.
Thank you to both for coming. Always a pleasure to have you in to our meetings. How have the academic and administrative salaries and expenditures increased over the past 2 decades in relation to the CPI increases?
So in general, what we find is that CPI tends to be 1 to 2% lower than what we call here the API. Reflects just fundamentally different sorts of drivers of inflation. And I would say that that's at least a decades-long process, and it's not unique to us. It's seen across the country.
Councilor Fruit, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for taking the time to come to us. The only question I had, and I'm not sure, if you can answer this just like right here. But like, what kind of different revenue sources are you usually looking into? So I know over the past few years, you guys have been trying to expand those. So it's not just like traditional, we're not just relying on inflation or granting.
Great question, and the situation we're in now is frankly better than what we thought before the election. As you may know, back in 2013, the government, the Redford government at the time, took a sharp turn in a different direction when it came to funding post-secondary, and we landed with a cut that was on the order of about 7% that year, with frankly about 2 weeks before the fiscal year started and no consultation. That really presaged a bit of a tone that was set by the Conservatives for the following years, which was, you need to diversify revenue because the government grant is only going to go one way, and it's not the right way. So we started working a number of years ago, it would be about 3 years ago, on a revenue diversification strategy. And there's a number of things that have been put out there. One of which you may have heard of is referred to as the Land Trust. And so this is a plan to develop some of the university-owned property around South Campus and put that into a trust which would create a continuing revenue source for the university. That's gone through governance. The trust has been created and approved by government, but for over a year they've been sitting on a request to actually move some property into the trust. So the trust exists on paper, it's got its board of directors, it's got all its approvals, it just has no property. And they've not moved on putting any property into the trust so that we can move it forward. In part based on a report that the Auditor General issued just over a year ago, which basically said that the ministry did not have in place proper mechanisms to monitor those sorts of initiatives. So they weren't concerned about the initiative, they felt that the ministry didn't have the ability to oversee it. So until the ministry satisfies the Auditor General and puts those in place, the government's not prepared to move on allowing us to actually make the trust operational. The other major area that we were planning to have revenue generation activities around are around specialized academic programs, in particular professional master's degrees. So many disciplines, I'm from engineering, for example, and my professional body, APEGA, requires me to every year do professional development activities. That's not an unusual expectation in many professions. Those practicing individuals who maybe been in the profession for 10, 20 years need opportunities to get either courses or additional degrees. They're looking for something that's very specialized, and we have the expertise to deliver those. And so they've been under development in a number of programs. An early example of that would be, let's say, the executive MBA program, which very pricey, but it's going to students who are either well established in their careers and have access to resources and feel that this is a really strong professional advancement opportunity, or else are covered by corporate training budgets. So that was certainly an area that we have been looking at. Unfortunately, the government, with some uncertainty about what this framework that they should have around managing tuition regulation. So right now, it's a very simple model, CPI. The problem with that is if we try and launch these professional kinds of programs, they need to be in a framework where if they're not having expenses and revenues balanced, we need to be able to adjust them. And so the ability to influence the tuition up or down as the market drives is prevented under the current regulation. So the government has basically put a hold on the approval of most of these revenue generation professional programs. So that's unfortunately where we are with the revenue generation opportunities. There are a number that are happening that are successful, but they're at a very small scale. The larger ones we've been somewhat frustrated by government policy. Not that they object in principle, but they need to move some things forward, and their agenda docket right now is very full, and this hasn't been a priority.
All right, thank you.
Sorry for the long answer.
Oh, no, it's fine. Details always appreciated.
If I could just add to that, there's an organization that tracks best practice in higher education across North America called the Education Advisory Board, and all institutions are looking at revenue generation opportunity, and every one that is identified in terms of best practice by the Education Advisory Board are what we're doing now, as Steve discussed, subject to the limitations that we're faced with. Other things would be things like philanthropy, growing our scholarships, our endowments, those sorts of things, and growing research funding to then attract indirect costs, which help our operating budgets. Those are the other revenue generating initiatives that we're pursuing, which is consistent with best practice, of course, across North America.
And sorry, one more part of that. We have been fairly successful in growing the endowment. The endowment's over $1 billion, but interest rates are so low right now that doesn't actually translate into meaningful revenues. So when markets recover, we'll actually have something there, but for the short term, it's been a negative operation for us rather than a positive one.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Christensen, no? Councillor Larson?
Thank you very much for coming out. It's been fantastic to hear and great to get some information. What I'm really curious about, and I would like to see expanded on a little bit, is when you have said that you want to put an added price of $4,000 onto the cost of tuition to make it more marketable. Can you just expand a little bit onto what that means when we're saying marketable in our international tuition costs, and who that would be driving towards?
So again, that is only for the graduate students, and it is not a real increase. It's one that's fully offset. What it allows us to do is, if I can back up, can you go to the previous table? This one. So I'd like to just draw your attention to these two right-hand columns. So these are the international graduate tuition for the top 15 universities. We're number 14 of the 15, and we're about half of what the average is. If you're an international student from the other side of the country, the world, and you're trying to shop around for where is an institution that you would like to go and study at, you don't know much about the U of A. You don't know much about, frankly, most of the universities because they're a long way away. What you can find are what are the levels of tuition. And interestingly enough, that is your first indicator of perceived quality. It's not a good indicator, but we don't always make decisions based on a full set of information. And our hope is by not being at the very bottom of this pool, we don't look like we're the very lowest quality U15 university. We hope that keeps the conversation going about the U of A long enough that they actually learn about us. They learn about the quality of our programs, they learn about the exciting research that's happening, and the conversation continues long enough that we are a contender in decisions about, do I go to the U of A, or I've heard of this place called Vancouver, maybe I'll go there. So it's just marketing. We just want to take the 4,000, move our sticker price up, and then give the 4,000 back as part of financial support, so that it is actually not more expensive to come here, but it looks like we have a more valuable product, if you will, to offer.
I do understand it's not exact for undergrads, but it's just something slightly confusing to myself.
It's a little counterintuitive, but we have some pretty good data that shows that price and desirability are definitely correlated in the higher education market.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm an international student. I have a question. I was just wondering if the tuition increase, the 3.2% could be passed on to incoming international students, and the current students have the same structure.
The intent is that we go through an annual process of reviewing and generally increasing tuition. So this will be what our annual process for the coming year will look like. So it would apply to both incoming and existing students.
So if it's only applied to incoming students, will there be a drastically different implications, or can it be applied only to incoming students because it's an increase for us?
The challenge with what we generally refer to as grandfathering, so existing students see no change. The challenge is that we will have to effectively manually go in and adjust salaries, tuition, and the cost of that will largely offset any financial benefit of increasing it all. So we've taken an across-the-board approach. The across-the-board approach reflects the fact that all students, whether they're incoming or already here, are receiving the same services which are costing us more to deliver.
Yeah, go ahead.
Again, thank you for your presentation. I'm also an international student, an undergrad international student. And my question is, with the increase of tuition fees for international students, would the university provide more resources as bursaries and scholarships to international students, undergrad, as you said, for example, with the grad students, they will be compensated $4,000.
I will point out that the graduate students are also getting the 3.02.
Yeah.
It's the 4,000 is coming on and off, but the 3.02% is for everybody. In terms of the intent here is it's really it's intended to cover our inflation. Well, it's intended to just cover a fraction of our inflationary costs. So it's not bringing net new resources. This is bringing about $2.5 million to the budget. Our whole is almost 10 times that. So it does not bring us a pot of money that we can then use to provide new sources of financial support to students. That's not to say that we don't have student financial support systems that will be maintained, and we recognize that this can create problems for people who are right on the margin, and so it will be an area that we have the vigilance around, and we're certainly working to look at solutions like increasing donations, and something I probably should have said earlier is along with the tuition freeze, the minister on October 9th announced a process to review the tuition fee regulation framework. And So that's a process that's going to be going through over the course of the next, well, they're hoping to finish it by about April, May, with the idea that then the minister gets advice from the process that allows new regulation to be put in place by fall. Part of that review is around how do we build effective student aid systems. So part of what we're doing as part of this is advocating to government on how they can help us and them working together to make sure that we have effective student aid systems.
Hopefully it will be satisfactory for international students. Because with the rate that bursaries that international students receive at the moment is really low. Back at the French campus, I'm from the French campus. Back at the French campus, basically once a week we receive like an email saying that there's a couple of bursaries you can apply to. You open them, nothing is available for international students. You only have to be Canadian citizen or at least permanent resident. So for me personally, it's kind of really frustrating to get these emails, and every time they don't have the ability to apply for bursaries. And even the ones that we already applied for, there's a big number of international students. The competition is very high, and it's not really for everyone to get the bursary.
Well,
Also, the cost of the amount is really low compared to other bursaries that is provided to domestic students.
A component of all of the international differential, the IDF, which is the difference between the left-hand set of columns and the right-hand set of columns, a fraction of that is put aside for dedicated financial support. So it may be that as our international student population has grown, we need to revisit. I'll have a discussion with the registrar about whether or not we have a hole there.
Thank you very much. We'll go next to Councilor Monda.
Hi, thanks again for the presentation tonight. So I just wanted to ask if there's any sort of plan or thinking around making the international tuition increases more predictable from year to year. Because right now it seems that international tuition seems to rise randomly each year, which seems very disruptive for international students and probably isn't a very good selling point when people are applying to come to the U of A and that they don't know how much their degree is going to cost, which doesn't seem very ideal. So is there any plan to maybe limit the percentage it can increase or guarantee to students when they're applying that they can expect it to only increase this much each year, whether that's CPI, API, or something like that?
I would say that our plan going forward, barring something unpredictable coming out of the review that I just talked about, which is not an unreasonable probability, frankly. Barring something unusual coming out of there, our position is that the API is our inflation rate that allows us to cover costs. That would be what we would put in front of students as the predictable rate that we would increase the international student fees at. As Philip explained, it is a proactive, so it is looking forward. Our ability to predict forward depends a bit on where we are with our collective agreements. Right now we have about 2 years of predictability, and then we'll be back to negotiations with our main bargaining units, and it becomes a little harder for us to predict going forward. But the number 3.02 be pretty much what we would expect next year as well, because we've got exactly the same drivers and we know what they are going to be for next year.
The other aspect that we incorporated into the mandatory non-instructional fees was a ceiling of 5%. So the calculated API not to exceed a ceiling of 5%. So that gives hopefully a higher degree of predictability to those students that would be looking at it going forward.
And before you ask, there's also a floor of 0%.
Oh, yes.
Councilor Larson, go ahead.
I'm going to ask a question on behalf of somebody who's been following us online. They're very concerned about the fact that the original argument for the differential fee was to make up in differences between how domestic and foreign students are subsidized, as far as I go and understand in the history. He's also very concerned about the fact that now we're using these to cover revenue shortfalls instead of trying to subsidize the differences between students. And his question is basically, how is it fair for international students, and how can we explain to international students that they are going to have to accept that they're going to have to cover this revenue shortfall, instead of either the university finding ways to make cuts, or us finding or our university finding ways to basically renegotiate some of these commitments that they have made otherwise. That's the gist of what I can understand, but if there is any way that that can be explained to international students, I think it would be very much appreciated.
So we have asked the international students only to cover the fraction of the increase of our cost that applies to them. Mm-hmm. We hope that the increases that apply to domestic students will be covered by government through a backfill grant. But as I said earlier, we don't have any assurance of that. It probably won't happen, but we can hope. So if that does happen, then everybody is, well, the burden added by the increases in our costs get divided. It's just that instead of students paying, if they're domestic, government is paying for them. Yeah. But it allows us to effectively cover our increases, maintain quality of all of our programs. We really don't want to cut. That it starts a spiral of degradation, which doesn't serve anybody in the province. We are just looking for sustainability. We're not trying to use this as a cash cow to grow some great scheme. We just simply want to cover our inflationary costs so that next year the labs, the teaching labs that you're having your labs in are no worse than they are this year. That the number of TAs that you have is the same. That's all we're trying to do, is make sure that there isn't an erosion of our ability to deliver the programs.
Thank you very much.
We have about 5 more minutes. Are there any other questions? Vice President Patches?
Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate you coming in here and giving us the information firsthand. My question is specifically around what communication strategy do you have in relaying the information on these changes to students? And you're welcome to answer that first part separately. We asked the second part, but I want to get into that with my chest first so I remember. But the second part is, I know we talked about a lot, we touched on points about predictability, etc. in this, and you mentioned that the API is most likely what it will be. Is there a strategy to communicate that level of predictability to prospective students so that when they enroll, they know that this is the increase they will be facing? Or will it be reliant upon that API being calculated year to year?
So 2 good questions. Part of the strategy of communications is venues like this. Now, it's not real until it's approved by the board, so I'm not putting it on any websites or sending out communication to external folks when we don't know if that's going to be the case. But once it is approved, there is a standard set of processes that the registrar has about communicating what tuition will be to those who are here. Those who are not yet here, we would be updating websites as to this is what you can expect your costs to be should you come here, and we would try and build into that an explanation of what the academic price index is about. I would prefer to allow it to float year to year, but I don't expect, barring major changes to our collective agreement settlements, I don't expect major differences for what you see here going forward. So, Could be 2.9, it could be 3.1, but it's not going to be 4 next year.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Kiani, go ahead.
So, from my understanding, we are still unsure of how much money we will be getting from the government of Alberta. So isn't it a bit premature to kind of increase charges for international students, considering we're not exactly sure of how much revenue we're getting? And then also, will the fact that we are increasing fees for international students affect how much money we could potentially get from the government?
If I can start with the second question, the amount that we're talking about here, roughly 2.5 million or so, from the international fee increase that I proposed here, I don't expect that's going to have an impact on what the government does, given that they're dealing with a number which is currently about 600 plus million, and 2 million is so small compared to that number that they're not going to say, oh, the U of A have solved all of their problems, we don't need to give them any more money. They'll be very aware of our $23 million problem that we're trying to bridge. So I don't expect that this is going to have an impact on any funding decision that we'll see in the March budget. The reason that we do this now, I'm told in the past we brought our tuition proposals at the same time as our overall university budget, which we would bring in March. From what I understand, the argument was made to us by students, frankly, that this needs to be done earlier so that the conversation can focus on tuition rather than on budget. And so we're trying to honor that request by bringing it through now. It also gives us the ability, particularly for recruitment, students who are going to be coming here in the fall. International students start shopping earlier, and so their question about what is tuition in the fall going to be is one that they're worried about now, more so than domestic students who they've got a smaller number of universities that they're probably looking at, and for many of them, about half of our students are coming from the greater Edmonton area, and their need for this clarity is less acute because they're not shopping quite as broadly.
Awesome, thank you very much. So we've hit our 7 o'clock mark. I currently have one person on speaker list, and I'm not sure if the provost or Philip, Mr. Stack, sorry, can stay any longer, but I would imagine that one avenue to ask questions through is through the executive that can ask these questions of the provost and the vice president of finance, or Mr. Stack. So unless you're able to stay for an additional 15 minutes or something.
I'm at your disposal.
We don't want to push you out. You know that you have to go to work tomorrow at some point.
But I'm at your disposal.
So, unless I see a motion to extend, we'll move on from the presentation. Yes, Vice President Bannister?
I will have a motion to extend
By?
an additional 10 minutes.
All right, so let's say 7:10 p.m. Is there a seconder for this motion? Councilor Monda, is there anyone opposed to extending the presentation by an additional 10 minutes? Seeing none, we will continue. We have another question from Councilor Larson.
Oh, it's from me? Okay, I guess just as a larger question, and I know you've already touched on it, your conversations with the government and with our current government, and Bishmillah did steal the question right out of my mouth. That wasn't gonna be my last question, but what I would like to ask is, it seems a very, very expedient way to cover our revenue shortfall to ask students who, at the moment, aren't able to have a loud enough voice to say that they don't want these changes. When the more difficult path might be to lobby our government so seriously to say that if you don't cover this revenue shortfall, we will have a massive cut in our services, and the name of the University of Alberta and the name of Alberta will be detrimentally affected because of this. So in my mind, that I can see the reasoning as in that we really understand and we don't want to lose any of these services, but the harder path and maybe would have been a lot more appropriate would have been to ask the government, with this freeze, have you expedited some sort of loss, and is there any way for you to cover that? If you do have any more words on that sort of subject, and specifically on how the U of A as a greater whole, I know that our executive team does it all the time, has talked to the government about covering these revenue shortfalls and what the responses have been, and why we aren't taking that harder path, which is not asking students directly to cover those revenue shortfalls, especially a very smaller, less vocal, and more diverse community.
So it's a good question, and absolutely we are advocating to government to allow us to keep our tuition at a minimum by increasing our overall grant. The problem has been that on average they're not increasing the grant at the same rate that even tuition has been increasing. And the argument they make, which is a very valid argument, is if you look at the government support per student, only Saskatchewan has a higher level of government funding than Alberta does. And if we look at the trends, particularly in Ontario, there's been over the last decade a very deliberate and significant transfer of the burden of responsibility of paying for education from government to student. So while we try and eloquently argue for greater funding, it is a hard argument to make because out of just about all of the jurisdictions in North America, we're pretty much the top in terms of government funding per student.
Thank you very much for your response. I do believe most of us have some understanding of the workings of tuition. As always, I think we will continue to advocate that it doesn't go up, that international students don't cover this burden. I'm more or less speaking on my own views now, but thank you again for coming. I really do hope in the future that the U of A continues to make that eloquent argument that I am not capable of making, and we hope to see you again hopefully sometime in the future if I'm going to be the closing remarks as the last question, unless we have 10 more minutes.
There's lots of other questions.
Nice. Thank God.
We'll go with Vice President Bannister.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me try my mic. So this is actually the second time I've seen this presentation, the first one being at the Academic Planning Committee. And I just have a follow-up question. So at the Academic Planning Committee, Sarah Ficco, the president of the GSA, asked a great question about how administration will be planning to communicate this change to students, and noted that oftentimes it does fall on the shoulders of student representatives to deliver that information, even though we're not the ones making this change. So I also asked at that meeting what information would be available on the website, including projections, so students could financially plan for the duration of their degree. And at the APC meeting, the answer was no, projections will not be supplied on the website. However, today, when Vice President Patches asked, the answer was yes. So I was just wondering if you could clarify exactly what projections will be available to students so they can financially plan for their degree, and how that information will be distributed if or if not on the website. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. The point made at the Academic Planning Committee is that no one has the authority to say the tuition will be a certain level until the board has approved it. And the board approves tuition on a year-by-year basis. So I cannot go to anyone and say, well, not next year, but the year after, your tuition is going to go up by a particular number. The best we can do is say numbers have typically been, and provide some examples. which can be useful in planning, but must not be taken as a commitment that this is what you will see, because, as I say, the board jealously protects its ability to be the sole determinant of what tuition will be. In terms of communication, it is generally straightforward to communicate expectations around undergraduate tuition, because pretty much everybody goes to the registrar's website. The challenge that was raised in the context of graduate students is the recruitment vehicle there is a lot different. People who are interested in graduate studies generally go to department websites, because admissions are done at a department level, not in a central office like the registrar's office. And so that means that information that sits at department websites is less standardized, and that's a bit of a challenge that we have, because we have 72 departments on campus, each of which has a different person responsible for maintaining their websites. So there is a challenge around information control and consistency. And one of the things that I'm doing tomorrow is I'm going to FGSR, Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research Council, to talk about the messaging, both of the 3.02%, but also the other parts that I talked about earlier.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hashim, did you have a question? No? Okay. Probably the last question will go to Councillor Christensen.
Hi there. Thank you again. I really like the presentation. I was just wondering, so the tuition is going to, the increases will fill about that 2.3 million, or however much it was. But then there's the 20, it was about 20 was the total shortfall. What is going to be done about that, particularly, in case I missed it in the presentation?
Well, our biggest single source of revenue is the provincial grant. It's a question. It likely won't be over 2%. That's about as optimistic as we could possibly be. Could well be zero, could even be negative. But if that 2% happens, that's about 12 million. That still leaves about 8 million short. If we get the backfill as well, that's about half of that. If we get to that point, we've got about 4 million to find. And that's just going to have to boil down to belt tightening. We unfortunately end up in about the same place every year. We need to find something like 1% of efficiency every year, which is a very difficult thing to do on a year-over-year basis. And our hope is that some of those revenue-generating activities that I talked about earlier will finally get through the logjam and be available for us to start to be more effective at covering the budget shortfall.
Thank you very much. With that, our next 10 minutes of the presentation have expired. At this point, I think it's probably appropriate to move on to the next presentation. Again, if you would like to, if you have any further questions that come out of this presentation or from the materials that I think will be posted on the SU's website, I'm sure you can direct them to the executive team, who will then pass them along to through the appropriate channels. But I would like to thank these two gentlemen for coming out and providing us with the presentation tonight on tuition. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to very much thank you for this opportunity, and just echo what you had suggested. Fahim and Marina are very effective at bringing your message to us, so by all means, please continue to bring it.